Welcome to a quick discussion of Guilty Gear Strive. After a several-year break from the series, I decided to give it another try earlier this year because of Strive's newfound popularity. I wanted to highlight some of the reasons why this game is as popular as it is, and also go over my thoughts and concerns about the future of this game. To show off the basic mechanics, we'll be jumping into the training mode. Right away, one of my biggest concerns for Strive is its roster. So there are about 15 characters currently, more characters are being added through season passes, but overall this is kind of a small roster, and it's actually missing my main from the Guilty Gear game I started with. I started with Guilty Gear XX Accent Core Plus for PS3. And I mostly played as Jam, who is rumored because of data mining, but still isn't in the game yet. So I actually had to learn a new character, so that was actually kind of fun. Luckily, each character has a star rating to show how difficult they are to play. For example, Kai Kisk is a 5-star character, meaning he is one of the easiest characters to play as. And then you have Zato 1, who is a 1-star character, and is considered one of the most technical characters. So for this demonstration, I'll be playing as Kai, and our opponent will be Kai's rival, Soul Bad Guy. I think it's safe to say that one of the most appealing parts of Guilty Gear is its presentation, and it's honestly been that way for a while. The character models in the most recent Guilty Gear games are actually 3D models that are animated and shaded very specifically to look like they're out of an anime. It's honestly really impressive. This technique was first used by Arc System Works in Guilty Gear Xrd, which is the game before this. It was popularized in Dragon Ball FighterZ by the same developers. And I think that's a big reason why more people paid attention to Strive than past Guilty Gear games, because people now know them as the developers of Dragon Ball FighterZ, and because of Dragon Ball's popularity, it also makes Arc System Works stand out a lot more. But this game is a 2D fighting game, a one-on-one fighting game. You have 5 major buttons to use. You have punch, kick, slash, and heavy slash. If you're playing on PlayStation, they're actually conveniently color-coded. So punch is square, kick is X, slash is triangle, and heavy slash is circle. You also have dust, which is used to like stagger opponents like that, and also launch opponents into the air, if done correctly, like so, to deal extra damage. Other button combinations include the burst, which basically knocks enemies back, and there's also the Roman cancel, which is performed by either pressing a button shortcut like that, or by pressing 3 buttons together. This basically lets you cancel out the end lag for an animation or for an attack. So for example, you can basically immediately attack again when normally you'd have to wait for the animation to finish. So yeah, overall Guilty Gear is kind of complicated, but this game in particular is a lot more beginner-friendly. Before I played Strive this year, I did try Xrd Rev 2, which was the last version of that game. So I actually got used to a lot of the mechanics in that game, and actually going to Strive was difficult because of how different the mechanics are. So yeah, the basic structure of the game is the same. You have most of the same features, but the actual like combo strings are a little bit different and kind of simplified. So for example, a lot of characters in Accent Core and Xrd have a basic combo of all the 4 main buttons in sequence, but as you might have noticed, by pressing punch and kick consecutively, nothing happens. So you actually can't combo those anymore. You can combo slash and heavy slash like so. There's also close slash and far slash, which can also be comboed into like crouching variants of like heavy slash. And various special moves can also be chained together as well. Another new addition is wall breaks. That was not in older Guilty Gear games. So yeah, in general, this game is actually really fascinating to me because it's still very Guilty Gear, I think, but it does feel a lot more simple, which is another reason why I feel like this game is actually kind of taken off in popularity from where the series had been, because it's honestly a lot easier to learn all of the mechanics of compared to some of the past games. For example, my main in Strive, who I'll be showing off a little bit later, I tried playing as the same character in Xrd and did not have much luck because the move list for that character was ridiculously long. For a fighting game, this is honestly not a very long move list. I know Kai is one of the more straightforward characters, but yeah, this is still a fairly small move list. So yeah, there's a lot less you have to memorize, which is definitely a double-edged sword, because on one hand, you have less you have to memorize. On the other hand, you also have fewer options in general. But everything deals a lot more damage than past Guilty Gear games. So for example, if we use our special move here, it deals a ton of damage. Combining that with the wall break, that took out half of Soul's health. So in general, it feels like you're kind of doing the same amount of damage as like a really long combo, but in a really short combo instead. So yeah, instead of like, punch kick slash heavy slash, it feels like you're kind of doing the same amount of damage with just slash and heavy slash. But yeah, there are pros and cons to this approach. In general, I don't mind as someone who's bad at fighting games, and definitely gave up on games like Accent Core because they were way too complicated for me. I've actually gone back to that game as well, and I've actually had a lot more luck with that game now that I kind of understand mechanics by playing Xrd and Strive. The only problem is having to unlearn how some of the mechanics in Strive work and how they work differently than in Accent Core. Yeah, in general, the Guilty Gear series is relatively accessible, actually. Like, you can basically play almost every game except Guilty Gear X on Steam. That doesn't apply to different versions. For example, Guilty Gear XX Accent Core Plus R is the version on Steam, and that actually has different story elements than Guilty Gear X2. Is it worth playing X2 because of just the story? Probably not. You can probably just read about it. But that is also a problem in a lot of Guilty Gear games, is how they basically change out story elements over time with different re-releases. So you kind of have to buy a lot of versions of games if you want the full story, unless you just want to just look it up online and read about it or watch cutscenes. So yeah, in general, I do like this game a lot. I've been playing it quite a bit. Even online, I've been having success to some extent. The online is interesting, and I'll talk a little bit more about it in a bit. But for now, let's actually try to change the CPU to actually attack us, to show off some more of the mechanics. So there are also, there's also a special guard if you hold back and 2 buttons at the same time, but it trains the tension gauge, which is used for specials. The tension gauge is actually really cool in this game. I'm not sure how other fighting games do it, but in addition to attacking, you can also build the tension gauge by simply walking towards your opponent, which I feel like emphasizes sort of the aggressive style of fighting game that Guilty Gear is. Like, it's not as defensive as other fighting games. You tend to kind of it's kind of about dealing a ton of damage quickly. At least that's how I kind of interpret it. Even though the AI is set to like 25%, I'm still not doing great, just because I'm not the best at fighting games. But yeah, I also really like the stage backgrounds. Again, this game's art style is really solid. It's probably one of the more interesting fighting games I've played, and the aesthetics are a big part of that, to be honest, and definitely a big reason why this game stands out, because I remember seeing the first trailer from this game as a very casual Guilty Gear fan who had only played one game prior to seeing that trailer, and I was like, wow, this looks really cool. And like the slow-mo and the way the animations are kind of like, kind of skip frames to make it look more like an anime. but in a way that still doesn't affect the fluidity of actually controlling the game. So yeah, from an animation perspective, this is probably one of the best fighting games I've seen, but the mechanics are a lot more simple compared to past games, for better or worse. I actually want to change gears a bit. That was not an intentional pun, by the way, and I actually want to go back to the main menu. So I wanted to talk a bit about the other options. In the dojo menu, there's like a cinematic tutorial of sorts where you basically have like a story-driven tutorial between Sol and Kai. You also have missions. The mission mode in this game is fantastic. You basically have a series of different moves that you have to perform a certain amount of times to clear each mission. So like you have to clear a certain you have to perform a specific technique 3 out of 5 times to clear a mission, which is a great way to basically learn some of the techniques that like the common techniques that you'll need. It's a great way to learn all the mechanics, and honestly, tutorials is one of the areas where Guilty Gear has really succeeded recently, because Xrd also has a ridiculous amount of tutorials and various like training modes. So yeah, that in addition to the overall mechanics being a little bit simpler than other fighting games, including past Guilty Gear games, the amount of tutorials is also another reason why I feel like this game is actually doing really well, because it is generally a lot easier to pick up and play compared to other fighting games. As someone who has tried other fighting games and has not really managed to get good at those games because of just being overwhelmed by the mechanics and not having detailed tutorials to kind of reinforce the muscle memory of those mechanics. You also have an arcade mode. It actually works differently than in Xrd, and I actually don't like this as much. So in Xrd, the arcade mode basically acts like a prequel to the story. So you go through each character's like perspective of their events right before the main story begins. In this arcade mode, it's a lot more straightforward, I find. The one confusing aspect is, depending on how well you do, you'll fight a different boss at the end. Well, not a different boss, but the boss will be tougher at the end for a variety of reasons, like you won't have a co-op partner, or the boss will just be ridiculously overpowered. I have not cleared the hardest difficulty for the arcade mode because I am not that good at the game. But there is also a survival mode, an endless mode. In general, I feel like the single-player modes are kind of lacking in this game. There was a medal mode in older Guilty Gear games where you could basically earn medals by defeating opponents, and that was in Accent Core and Xrd, and that is not here. I hope it gets added back eventually, because I actually did play that quite a bit in Xrd. Of course, there's a standard 2-player match mode, but there's also a lot of online options. It basically uses a lobby system where you make avatars and basically you can kind of go around this little side-scrolling area to match up with players. The actual online quality is really good, but I actually find it takes a long time to initialize a match. In general, I've had a lot of matches fail to initialize, and also the initial load time into the online is very long. Even going from the title screen to the main menu of the game used to take like a minute to 2 minutes, and they actually shortened it to like under a minute, but it's still really long to just start up the game. One nice thing is there is like a tower system for the ranked mode, but also a another lobby system for just kind of like casual matches if you don't want to like risk losing your rank but still want to play with other people. And finally, for the options, there's the story. Starting with Xrd, Guilty Gear games do not have interactive stories. In Xrd, it's kind of a visual novel style story. In this game, it's like cutscenes. They're like 4 to 5 hours, so there is a lot of story, and I can't recommend jumping into the story if you're new to Guilty Gear. Definitely check out GG World instead, because this is basically a glossary of a lot of timeline and character information and terminology. Guilty Gear lore is a lot to take in, and even as someone who tried to play Xrd, partly because I wanted to know some of the story stuff for Strive, I was still incredibly incredibly lost by the story because I still missed out on several games, like the tactics game, Guilty Gear 2 Overture, which is canon and relevant to the current arc. So yeah, the story is a bit of a mess. I enjoyed it for what it was, but it definitely would have mattered more to me if I was more familiar with the overextending lore of the past games. So to close out this quick look at Strive, I am going to try to fight the CPU. I can't guarantee I'll win because I'm a little bit rusty at the game, but we will be picking my main, who is Ramlethal Valentine, introduced in Guilty Gear Xrd as the villain, if I'm not mistaken, and then ends up being a good character, starting with Revelator, which is the second version of Xrd. And I guess we'll pick Soul for opponent.
Mankind knew that they cannot change society, so instead of reflecting on themselves, they blamed the beasts. Heaven or hell.
穴からマジで来い。
話が済んだのなら始めよう。
Ramlethal versus Soul. Duel 1. Let's rock.
I'll be honest, I wasn't entirely expecting to have Ramlethal as my main character in this game, partly because I'm not the biggest fan of her character design because her cape is alive, and I find that kind of weird. It's actually more gross in Xrd because like her entrance animation has her cape like drooling. So yeah, I'm not the biggest fan of her character design, but I do like her playstyle. She basically has these large swords that she can actually fling all the way across the stage, and then they explode to deal a lot of damage. So she is very powerful, even though I definitely am not the biggest fan of that aspect of her character design.
Ramlethal wins. Duel 2. Let's rock.
I also find her stage theme to be a little slower than a lot of the other themes, and it's harder to get as, like, pumped up by the music compared to other characters. So whenever I play Ramlethal, I usually will swap over to a different character's theme, like something more up-tempo. But yeah, it's not a bad song by itself, but it definitely doesn't entirely work for like a fighting game song, in my opinion. But yeah, in general, I think she's a cool character, but yeah, the sentient cape is definitely not my favorite thing about her design. But yeah, she is definitely fun to play. She's also very high tier at the moment, so that was another reason why, even though she's a 3-star character, why I decided to try to learn her moveset, because I tried all the 4-star characters and was struggling with their movesets.
Soul wins. Duel 3. Let's rock.
Yeah, is set to normal, by the way, and I'm still kind of losing, which shows, yeah, I'm a little bit rusty. I'm also forgetting, like, roaming cancels and things like that, and I'm definitely playing a little bit too recklessly. So yeah, I definitely need to be careful if I want to actually win this round here. So far so good, I say that now, I don't want to jinx it though. So let's finish off this with a special, hopefully, or not. I do find some of the inputs a little bit tricky because I kind of panic and input the wrong thing. There we go.
Slap. Ramlethal wins.
So that was a quick look at Guilty Gear Strive. Overall, I am enjoying this game, but I do hope more characters get added, and mainly the characters I liked from the older games. But as is, it's still a very fun fighting game, and a pretty easy game to learn, even if you're not the best at fighting games like I am. So with that being said, thank you for watching, and I hope you'll join me next time for another discussion.